important. I want to make sure this is recording so that people can watch it later on YouTube. I'm Rabbi Michael Bernholtz from Temple Beth Shalom in Vero Beach, Florida. I initiated this last year, reaching out to my colleagues, asking if they wanted to do a 7-week session for the 7 weeks of the Omer. And I got an incredible response, and we continued it again this year with 14 colleagues, including myself. So we have paired up, and so over the 7 weeks of the counting of the Omer, we are teaching different books of one from the book of prophets, Jonah, and then the rest from the book of writings. And today we are joined with Rabbi Larry Malinger and Rabbi Rob Haas. They are going to be teaching us the book of Daniel. Rabbi Malinger will introduce himself, but he's from the New Jersey area, and Rob Haas Rabbi Haas is from the in Savannah, Georgia, at the historic congregation Mickveh, Israel. And so if you want to have a debate with him of whether that really is the oldest congregation, you are more than welcome to, or it's the oldest building, or it's the most southern because it has, I don't know. I'm sure Rabbi Haas,
there's some debates on those. I mean, it's the best congregation in the world. That's not where the debate is. It's really that's what we're debating, like the oldest in continuous. Charleston says it's the oldest in continuous use. Obviously, they're wrong. We are, but everybody has their wrong opinion.
So, and that's why we need pairs of rabbis, because every rabbi has the right opinion or the wrong opinion. And so it is wonderful to have Rabbi Malinger and Rabbi Haas here to share with us their perspectives of the book of Daniel. And so I am going to turn it over to them.
Rabbi Haas, you're going to go first, so go ahead.
I'm happy to go first. I may do like 10 minutes instead of all my full 20.
And Rabbi Haas, one more thing really quickly before we start, just for folks to be aware, please feel free to use the chat function if you have questions. That's a wonderful way to get our attention if you have a question. You can also use the raise hand function that shows us that somebody has a question. Using the camera, I've got a question method, will work eventually if we're on gallery view and can see you. We do ask that if you are not asking a question, you do mute your audio. That'll help with some of the background stuff. But it is just wonderful to have those chances to hear from some of our wonderful rabbis, and also to be able to ask some of those questions and their perspective. And now, Rabbi Haas, I am going to turn it over to you.
Thank you. Looking forward to it. Welcome, everybody. I hope you've enjoyed the previous sessions. Glad you're here. This will be obviously the best of all the sessions, so you're very fortunate to be here live. Looking forward to hearing Rabbi Malinger. So we're going to talk about the book of Daniel today, as you know. And the book of Daniel is a really interesting book in a wide variety of ways, but I think one of the most important ones is it just doesn't fit in anywhere else. It is a book unto itself. So let's look at why. So the Bible, or the Hebrew Bible, or the Jewish Bible, however you call it, the Tanakh, is divided into 3 sections. The first section is the Torah. The second section is the prophets, which has the books of the prophets and the rest of the historical books that come after the Torah. So those sections are set: Torah, prophets, and history. The third section is where you put everything else. You put the wisdom literature, stuff like Psalms. You have books that are connected to holidays, like Esther. You have the last 2 books of the Chronicles, the last 2 books which are connected to the story of David. And then you have Daniel, which is a book that doesn't fit in anywhere. It's kind of a book unto its own. And it's really interesting to have this book in here because it may be the last book actually written. So it goes much farther in history than any of the other books, probably written in the 2nd century. And we're going to see why it's a book unto itself and how it's a little different than everything else you'll probably read in the Bible for a wide variety of ways. First of all, he's not a prophet. He sees visions, but he's not a prophet. If he's a prophet, he would be in the book of prophets. He would be in the section of prophets. So he is a different type of character. He sees visions. He sees the future, but that's really not what a prophet does. A prophet is a person who will basically go from place to place and tell people what they're doing wrong. You, Sheldon, are misbehaving. You need to behave better. You, Rabbi Bernholtz, are doing great. You are a holy man like no other. That is what a prophet does. He not only sees visions of the future, what he does is tell people to behave. Daniel is not doing that in this story. Secondly, and perhaps even more importantly, if you are a prophet, you have to live outside the world. You can't be a part of the structure. A prophet, for instance, cannot have a job because I would be then beholden to my boss. So I may be more likely to treat my boss with kid gloves or to overlook his mistakes, which is something a prophet can't do. A prophet has to go to the king and say, you're misbehaving, and not worry if he's going to be killed or lose his income. Daniel has a job throughout pretty much the whole book, so he is therefore not able to be a prophet, even though he does have visions. So some people think he is a prophet, but he's not. Even the visions don't make you a prophet. But in any case, he couldn't be a prophet in one way because he comes or is written in the 2nd century BCE, before Common Era. The last official prophet was Malachi. He is in the 5th century. And so Daniel can't be a prophet, but then again, he actually could be a prophet, because even though it's written in the 2nd century, the date is in the 6th century. So according to the book itself, he could be a prophet in that time period. But when he's probably written, the prophets had ended a long time earlier. The books of the prophets section probably had already been set. And so in the 2nd century, he is a book unto himself, which is really interesting. Now, it's actually not one book in many ways, it's 2 books. There is the first 6 chapters and the second 6 chapters. The first 6 chapters are the narrative, more of a third person, what is going on during his life. The second 6 chapters, which Rabbi Malinger will really talk more about, are the visions of his world. And it's really essential for us to understand where he's coming from before we can actually delve into those visions. One of the ironies about him, by the way, is he sees the dreams of the kings, and he can tell what dreams mean, but when he has his own visions, he cannot understand his own visions. He has to basically hire angels to say what he's dreaming about. It's one of those ironies of that, and I know Rabbi Malinger will get more into that as we go along. Now let's go into the history first, because it's essential to understand where he's coming from. In 587 BCE, 586 BCE, the Babylonians take over Judah. Judah is the country where the Jews were living, now Israel. And the Babylonians take over Judah at the time. And the Jews are then sent into exile in Babylon. Now, are all the Jews going into Babylon? No, not all the Jews go into Babylon. We don't really know what happens in Babylon, really, but we do know that when the Jews go back to Israel, they start arguing with the Jews who are there. So that means some Jews stay in Israel, some leave. Probably what happened was the hierarchy, the more the leadership, the wealthy were the ones who were sent to Babylon. What we do know happens in Babylon is that they're treated fairly well. They stay as a community, they thrive, and Daniel really speaks to why that may happen. Daniel is about a guy who works for the king and becomes a very big shot, which may be explaining why the Jews in Babylon did so well, because they had people like Daniel who showed how worthy they were and how useful they were. And so even though we don't know what happens in Babylon, we have little hints that they did well, and this may be explaining why they did so well. So again, this period we're talking about where he's living is the mid to late 6th century. So 587, he's probably a kid at that time period. He's a child, and then moves to Babylon, and he will be there during the entire Babylonian reign over Israel. So while he's there, the Babylonians will rule, and then the Persians will overtake the Babylonians along with the Medes or Medes, however you call them. And so he will be there during the entire time of the Babylonians going into the next empires. So he is so good at his job that when the Babylonians are overcome and the Persians take over, he keeps his job. That's how good he is. So he is going to be there for several empires. And what we'll see in the visions is the vision, he talks about the future empires going all the way to the Greeks. Larry, Rabbi, are you going to talk about that part? Okay, so knowing that he is living during...
Forgive me interruption. You and I will have a lot of overlapping, which is fine. So we're going to reinforce
You
it.
want me to stop and let you go so I'm not overlapping completely? Okay. So, and you can, so basically his book talks all the way about the Greeks. So going from the Babylonians, Medes, Persians, and Greeks. So 4 empires, really 3 though, but we'll see that it's named 4. And he is going to be a big shot leader in the time he's living, but he also speaks about the future. Now, there's 2 sections, probably written by 2 different groups. Daniel A would be the first 6 chapters. Some think it's one author. Daniel B is the second 6 chapters, which many people think were a variety of authors. So it's not one author. Another reason they believe it's in the 2nd century it's written because it's probably all in Aramaic originally. Some of it has been translated in Hebrew. I am not a scholar, but the scholars believe they were translated from Aramaic to Hebrew, the sections in Hebrew, because Aramaic was the language that was spoken. Now, are you going into the parts about the apocalyptic cults and the way the world was working?
I am, but go ahead, because it's going to be something that has to be reinforced because of the differential between Judaism and Christianity.
Okay, great. The idea of the apocalyptic view of end of days is really a type of viewpoint in literature that happens from like 200 BCE to 100 CE. So that's the main time. So the 300 years is when we're going to start developing this idea of the end of days and the idea of heaven. He is the link for us because if you read the Bible, it doesn't speak about heaven. It doesn't speak about the Messiah, maybe a hint, sort of, because Judaism is all about God telling us if you behave, you're going to be rewarded. And if you misbehave, you're going to be punished. That's the whole Bible. But what happens as time goes on, people seem to realize that that is not the way the world works. Rabbi Malinger is misbehaving. He's a terrible person. Everybody knows that, yet he's got a daughter who is getting married. He's successful. He's beloved. He's got a wife he doesn't deserve. And I know he is a bad person, yet he's thriving. Whereas Rabbi Bernholtz is a wonderful person, and he may not be, maybe terrible things. He's got boils. He doesn't have, no one loves him, but yet he's a good person. So people are already seeing this problem. So what you're starting to see is eventually this idea that we're not rewarded on this earth. We're going to be rewarded in the next world. And that only starts to become part of Judaism later on. So what we have to remember is this idea of apocalyptic visions and heaven are developed in Judaism after Judaism's been around for over 1,000 years. Whereas it's developed at the same time Christianity is being developed. So think about it. Which religion talks more about the end of days and heaven, the Christianity or Judaism? Generally speaking, it's Christianity. A lot of Jews don't even realize Jews believe in heaven. Most Christians don't understand that Jews believe in heaven because we don't talk about it that much. Because it's a later part of our religion. It's post-biblical for us. It's akin to language learning. Is it easier to learn a language from birth to 5 or when you're 75? It's much easier to learn a language, obviously, when you're a kid, because you will be much more fluent than anyone who learns a language at 75. Judaism is learning the language of heaven and end of days when we're way into our lifespan, whereas Christianity learns it at the very beginning. So it is really seeped in every part of Christianity. That's why they talk about it so often. It's not better or worse, it's just different. So when we look at Daniel, it is just the beginnings. It's just at the end of the beginning of the 2nd century where we start thinking about this idea of heaven. He doesn't talk about heaven, but we're getting there. It's just at the beginning of this idea of the Messiah. Doesn't talk about the Messiah, but we're getting there. And so basically what we see is a book that almost is a transitional book. It is a way to end the Bible and transition to the rabbis or the Pharisees, the proto-rabbis. And that's what we're seeing here, because Judaism would have ended if we only kept this view of you're rewarded in this world, because people obviously see that doesn't work. And so basically the story is about Daniel and how this kid is brought into the Babylonian leadership want to take these Jewish kids, the brightest, and bring them into the leadership to make them, lower level managers, probably mid-management. But Daniel and his 3 friends end up being really excellent at their jobs. And so Daniel rises up very much like Joseph, because he's able to predict and understand visions. He's able to predict the future in a way that will be financially good for the empire. And so during this period, there's obviously jealousy. There's jealousy against his 3 friends, so they're sent into the ovens. They come out unscathed. There's jealousy later against Daniel. He's obviously sent into the lion's den, which is the most famous part of this book. He comes out unscathed. The people who accused him are then sent into the lion's den. They don't come out unscathed at all, unfortunately. So the key is, if you're going to accuse somebody, don't accuse somebody who is a very adept lion tamer. And so when he goes in, he's fine, because when you go in, you may not be so much so. So this is a little bit of the background, and it's really a wonderful book. I'm now going to turn over to Rabbi Malinger, and we'll take questions at the end.
Okay, there was one brief question that I'm not sure, Sheldon Cantor, if you can clarify, weren't they the intelligentsia to begin with? Are you talking about the people who put together the book? I'm not sure what you're referencing.
Okay, I'm addressing the issue about those who were exiled were generally the leaders of the community.
Okay.
And when they came back, they were opposed by the Am Ha'oretz, who I'll translate into crude English, the dirt farmers.
Yeah, I mean, that's a way of looking at it. We don't know this for sure, because again, it may be rewritten from their perspective. But what's probably accurate is that the wealthier, the leadership, were taken to Babylon. There's no 100% confirmation. When they come back, obviously the people who were there are like, wait a minute, we've been here 50 years. Mm-hmm. But remember, the ones coming have the seal of approval from the Persian leadership. So not only are they wealthier, not only have they been living in New York City, which is the most educated place in the world, coming and moving to West Texas, but they've got the backing. So they have all the cards, and the people they're coming to don't have it. So there's obviously many rebellions between them, but all the power is going to be with those who are backed by the Persian Empire.
Okay, thank you. I am a visual learner and teacher, so I'm going to put on a PowerPoint on the screen. And I just need to do something here for myself. Okay, let me set this up. Okay, and do that, and voila. So as I said earlier, there is going to be some duplication, and not just because we're both preparing the same way. So yes, Daniel, the book of Daniel, one of the historical piece, as Rabbi Haas just shared, it is most likely the last book to be permitted in the canon of the Hebrew Bible. But the problem with that is that the writing of the book, or the book, appears like is happening in the 6th century before the Common Era as part of the Babylonian experience, meaning the destruction of the first temple, the Babylonian exile, and eventually the return back. That return, of course, is described in the books of Ezra and Nehemiah, which follow Daniel. And as Rabbi Haas also said, First and Second Chronicles is a little bit there, but it's also a connection or continuation of the reign of David and all the different kings in both the northern and southern kingdom. You see lots and lots and lots of duplication. As he said, the story of Joseph interprets dream, Moses, who has visions of the burning bush, to the very prophetic messages. But Daniel, as he said, is not a prophet. We think that he was, as he said, a teenager captured by the Babylonian army. And the very beginning of the book of Daniel talks about him and three of his friends who go to Babylon to learn the Chaldean language. Now, why are they chosen? The text tells us they're good looking, they're smart, they're intelligent. There's some sense of divine spirit with them. And like I said, it's all be on the YouTube. I'm just trying to give you the generic piece here. And talking about, we have cross references from the book of Isaiah and Jeremiah. And so we have two names for Daniel and Belteshazzar, which I'm going to show you that in a second. Just hold off in a second. So going back to why we think this is the last book is simply because we have the idea that this was during the time of the revolt of the Maccabees, which was around 168 to 165. And all of the characters that are mentioned in the book are related somehow to Antiochus IV. They're really code names because as he's writing, they're still running around with the Greeks fighting the Maccabees and who's in control and who's not in control. And so perhaps it was a way of protecting. We don't really know, okay? But we believe that a lot of the book of Daniel, which becomes the apocryphal book, meaning the end of days, which is the only apocryphal book in the Hebrew Bible, period, right? Is that the idea is to show us that Deuteronomic theology that was just shared, that if you do good things, you will have blessings. If you don't, it was nice knowing you. And so therefore, the book of Daniel shows us that Jews' devotion to prayer, keeping kosher, and monotheistic worship, and their hope that God would intervene to protect Jews who remain true to the Torah. The key phrase is that last line that I just stated. Because as Rabbi Haas alluded to, we really have no concept of heaven and hell. In the book of Genesis, it's very clearly stated that when you die, you are sent to the dark depths below, or Sheol. It's like a waiting room. The best modern example I can give you is the cinematic production of Beetlejuice, where they're all waiting in a waiting room in the Netherlands until whatever's next. The book of Daniel gives us the idea, as already shared, that there will be some sort of reward later on. But that idea is done in what I call a brushstroke. It's not a definitive theological statement. It is due to interpretations later on by the church fathers and in Christianity that started to change all that. We will come back to that shortly. But the point is that the world will acknowledge God's sovereignty, and the victims of Antiochus' persecution will be resurrected to glorious life. There will be a just reward at a later time. So I'm going to do very quickly the first three chapters just because I need to get those to a point. We've been very beginning, King Jehoiakim, from 597 BCE. This is prior to the final fall of Jerusalem in 586 BCE. But Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king, comes into power, and young Israelites of noble royal family, just as was asked, the intelligentsia, they're brought, to the land, and he is taught the language. He's basically going to become a court Jew, if you will, where he can be an interpreter between the Babylonians and the remnants of the Israelites, if you will. And the three companions of Daniel are basically, for lack of a better word, are followers of the mitzvot, of the commandments, and they follow the right rules. And they basically, God's presence with them, they can do no wrong. Okay. And so God gives insight to visions and dreams, and Nebuchadnezzar finds them 10 times better. In fact, at one point, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and he doesn't want to tell his wise men what they are. They have to guess, because he doesn't want them manipulating or twisting. And they said, well, they basically throw Daniel under the bus. And Daniel comes out and says, oh, here's what it is. And so he served that service. In chapter 2, he had these dreams of 4 kingdoms. Some of you may be familiar with the holiday of Passover. One of our closing songs, Chagaya, my father bought for Tuzizim, a baby goat or a billy goat, if you will. And it talks about the fire and the butcher and the angel of death and all that. All of those differentiations represent kingdoms that had taken over, and we're the goat. And we constantly are able to overcome the one after that. Well, this is also a symbol of that. And that is that he had this vision of this enormous statue with a head of gold, breasts and arms of silver, belly and thighs of bronze, legs of iron, and feet of mixed iron and clay. Then he sees the statue destroyed by a rock that turned to a mountain, filling the whole earth. He explains the dream that the statue symbolizes the 4 successive kingdoms, starting with Nebuchadnezzar, and then it will go along with the kingdom of Persia, Medes, and then finally Greece. The point is that as much as we want to believe that he had the vision to foretell what would be the following generations of leadership over the land, that's one of the reasons why we know it was written much, much later, okay? To validate, if you will, his strength to have these visions and dreams. The section here is about the fiery furnace. So we have Daniel's companions, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They built this humongous gold statue and said, everyone bow. If you don't bow, we're going to throw you in the fiery furnace. Well, Daniel and his friends don't do that. But Daniel is not present in this section of the story. He's somewhere else. But the 3 friends don't. And one of the guards said, look at those people. They're not doing that. Those people are different from us. The language is verbatim of what you find in the book of Esther. Those people are different from us. We need to remove them. That language of maintaining our own identity, which has been a very strong value of Jewish tradition, is once again challenged. And so they go into the fire, and he looks in and he sees that they're talking and dancing around each other. When they were thrown in the fire, their hands were bound behind their backs, and they're totally free and released. And Nebuchadnezzar sees a 4th person. Now, the problem is they accept, what did that say? In the Hebrew, it says, with the appearance like a son of the gods. He realizes now they come out untinged in any way, shape, or form. And the 4th person does not come out, is not there, and only Nebuchadnezzar sees it. And he decreed that anyone who blasphemes against God shall be torn from limb to limb. So we see the beginning of a potential ideology of a creature that's outside of our existence that gives us assistance. The problem is, what does that mean? I'm going to pause for 1 second. Only because I wanted to make sure you knew about these 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. They had actually Hebrew names, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And their names actually mean something, which I'll show you in a moment, but they are preserved from harm. In the Hebrew, Aneva Ha'ana Hazeh, Guvrin Arba'a Shirayin, Malhakin Begol Nura, V'chaval Lo Itai B'hom. Now, the point is that, look, I see the 4 men, they're loose, they're not bound anymore, and they're walking about in the midst of fire without harm. Lo Itai B'hom. And that's the phrase there. Levar el Lahin. The appearance of the 4th like the son of the gods. The King James Version changed it to son of God. So now you understand, once you translate something, it changes the meaning if people are not aware of its source. Hence, the Christological connection to the book of Daniel that says, see, the Hebrew Bible shows you that the Son of God is with you. I just need to do a very quick lesson on Messiah. The Hebrew is Mashiach. The word Messiah in Judaism means the anointed one. It comes from when Samuel is tasked to go to the house of Jesse to, quote, anoint David to be the successor to Saul. And ever since then, the idea of someone coming to, quote, establish or now restore the Davidic kingdom, where there's a world perfection, no more famine, no more war, no more pestilence, all the negatives, if you will, and everyone gets along. It is a human being, it is not a mythical creature. And you cannot die and come back to be the Messiah. That was never part of our ideology. And the Messiah is not a figure of God in Jewish thought. In Christianity, of course, they see Jesus' son, God's son Jesus, as, quote, the Son of God, and hence he is the anointed one. We do not interpret it that way. And so they're brought to Babylon to do all this, but their names were changed to be more Babylonian. Or could you say that Daniel and his 3 associates are becoming assimilated, but yet they still maintain their Jewish identity? And so I just wanted to give a real quick etymology. Daniel he becomes Belteshazzar. He's God a judge, is in Hebrew. Protected his life in the Babylonian, related to the Babylonian god Bel. Belshazzar, take out the T-E. Belshazzar is actually Nebuchadnezzar's. Some people think it's Nebuchadnezzar's son. Most other scholars say it was whoever succeeded his son. That's the guy, okay? You have Shadrach, who was Hananiah. Yah, meaning a name for God, has been gracious, and they believe that the variation of Shadrach is from the command of Aku, or the moon god. Meshach from Mishael, who is what God is. We don't know the Babylonian source of Mishael, probably another Babylonian deity. And Abednego, or Azariah, Yah has helped. And servant of the Nego, or in the later translation or mistranslation, Nebo, the mount where Moses, or Aaron first and then Moses die, is the mountain range in the Jordan Valley. But again, connected to some sort of deity concept. In other words, for them to be, quote, can be considered Babylonian, we have to give them names like that. And so again, if all of this is a smokescreen against Antiochus' power in the 168 to 165, perhaps is it to maintain that, to say, yes, we're not talking about now, we're talking about then, wink, wink. And so now, to repeat a little bit here, critical scholarship suggests that the first 6 chapters of Daniel are stories dating from the late Persian, early Hellenistic period, and Daniel's absence from the story of the Hebrew children in the fiery furnace suggests that it may originally have been independent. It forms a pair with the story of Daniel in the lion's den, which we'll see in just a moment. The point is that the God of the Jews will deliver those who are faithful to God. By the way, according to Jewish tradition, who was that 4th creature? According to the Talmud in Tractate Pesach, in folio 118a and b, the 4th individual was the angel Gabriel. Now, the truth is, Gabriel gets mentioned a little bit later in the book of Daniel. God is my strength. The purpose of the tale and the lion's den, again, is to affirm that God of Israel is the only God, and having faith in God, be ready to suffer martyrdom if necessary. I think that's more, I didn't write this, I copied this, but I want to say it's more of a commentary to the entirety of the book. Martyrdom is not, it is implied in the Bible, but it's not the absolute until after post-temple period. And the ongoing narrative, of course, is a powerful polemic to idolatry. Don't forget, the first temple fell because of idolatry, and so this just perpetuates that teaching. So here's a brief video on the fiery furnace.
Stories of the Bible, the fiery furnace. There once were 3 Jewish men named Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Hey! When they were very young, they were taken from Israel to live in a place called Babylon. At that time, the king of Babylon was a man named Nebuchadnezzar.
That's it. Almost there.
And he made a gold statue that was 90 feet tall.
Perfect.
The king sent a message for everyone to come to the dedication of his statue. When everyone had assembled, it was declared that people of all races, nations, and languages would bow before the statue and worship King Nebuchadnezzar's statue when they heard the sound of musical instruments. If anyone refused, they would be thrown into a fiery furnace. So at the sound of the musical instruments, all the people bowed to the ground and worshiped. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego did not, because they were Jewish and would only bow to the one true God. Some of the wise men of Babylon went to the king and told him that Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refused to bow to the statue.
What?
This made the king very angry, and he asked Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego if it was true that they would not bow to the statue. Then he said he would give them one more chance to bow down, and if they did not bow, they will be thrown into the fire. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego replied that they didn't need to defend themselves against the king. They said, if we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God whom we serve is able to save us. He will rescue us from your power, your majesty. But even if he doesn't, we want to make it clear to you, your majesty, that we will never serve your gods or worship the gold statue you have set up. The king was so angry with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego that he commanded the furnace to be heated 7 times hotter than usual. Then he ordered Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be bound and thrown in the fire. The fire was so hot that it killed the soldiers that threw them in. So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego fell into the flames. But suddenly, the king jumped up and said to his advisors, didn't we tie up 3 men and throw them in the furnace? The advisors said, yes. But the king said, look, I see 4 men walking around the fire, and the 4th looks like a god. Then the king shouted to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out! So Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego stepped out of the fire, and everyone saw that the fire had not touched them. They didn't even smell of smoke. Then Nebuchadnezzar praised the one true God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who had rescued them from the fire. And the king made a new command that anyone who spoke a word against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego would be greatly punished. Then he promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in his court. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego trusted in God and were willing to die rather than worship any god but their own God.
So that was chapter 3. We move to chapter 6, where we have another story of the same genre. The Jew is thrown into harm's way because they're not following whatever their perceived rules are. And the Jew who has faith in God is going to be safe and sound. And so he's saved by lions by God because I found blameless before him. It parallels and complements chapter 3, the previous story. And again, each begins with the jealousy of non-Jews towards successful Jews, and an imperial edict requiring them to compromise their religion, and concludes with divine deliverance and a king who confesses the greatness of the God of the Jews and issues an edict of royal protection. You are very familiar with another story, the book of Esther, when Ahasuerus recognizes that the Jews are on the right and make that royal edict as well. And so again, this is a much later writing down, even though the timeline of the story is supposed to be during the Babylonian Empire. After we get through the first 6 of the experiences to basically validate Jewish identity, then we hit the closing section, 7 through 12. 7 had Daniel's vision of the 4 world kingdoms, replaced by the kingdom of the saints or holy ones of the Most High, i.e. God's kingdom, which will endure forever. 4 beasts come out of the sea. The Ancient of Days sits in judgment over them, and one, like a son of man, is given eternal kingship. Again, a translation challenge. An angelical guide interprets the beast as kingdoms and kings, the last of whom will make war on the holy ones of God. Well, what abomination was erected at the time this is written? And that would be the desecration of the Holy Temple by Antiochus IV, i.e. otherwise known as the Hanukkah story. By the way, just an FYI, the Hanukkah story is in 1st and 2nd of the 4 books of Maccabees, but it's not part of the Hebrew Bible. And so that story had not been written down for a while until after the event, whereas this is writing as it's happening. And it's the last of the 4 kingdoms, but of course he's wrong, because Greece becomes Greco-Roman, the Roman Empire, and it's going to take time for that to happen as well. Although set during the reign or regency of King Belshazzar, the prophetic chapters of the book of Daniel date, as I said, to 167, 164, 168, 165. It's a matter of interpretation, okay? It is an apocalypse, though, a literary genre in which heavenly reality is revealed to be a human recipient, or eschatology, i.e. what happens after we die, a divine revelation concerning the moment which God will intervene in history to usher in the final kingdom. Its context is impression of the Jews by the Seleucid ruler Antiochus IV Epiphanes, who outlawed Jewish customs and built an altar to Zeus in the temple. The phrase abomination of desolation. You see that in First Maccabees, and we see it again here. Sparking a popular uprising which led to the retaking of Jerusalem and the temple. And then the idea of the four kingdoms in 7 is that the four kingdom, which empires, Babylon, Persia, Medes, Greece, and then eventually the Romans. So it's really 5, but it's only 4 that he's aware of at that time. Chapter 8 and 9 are different visions. 8 is the vision of the ram and the goat. The ram has 2 mighty horns, one longer than the other, and it charges west, north, and south. The key phrase is, it's coming from the east, overpowering all other beasts. We know that the ram is going to be the Medes and the Persians because that's where it's coming from. And the ram first, and then the goat that follows. The goat becomes very powerful until the horn breaks off and replaced by 4 lesser horns. A small horn that grows very large, it stops the daily temple sacrifices and desecrates the sanctuary for 2,300 evening and morning, which can either be 1,150 or 2,300 days, however you want to count it, until the temple is cleansed. The angel Gabriel informs him that the ram represents the Medes and the Persians, the goat is Greece, and the little horn is a wicked king. Again, modern and later, I say modern, later interpretation, if you will, okay? But the key phrase is we get to reinforce again that the stability is not going to be maintained until all of it's eradicated and the restoration of the Jewish kingdom. The vision of the 70 weeks. Darius the Mede, Daniel meditates on the word of Jeremiah. Jeremiah was the last prophet that was during the fall of the temple in 587, 586 BCE. And then, what we call the major prophets or the former prophets. So it'll be Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Ezekiel. And Isaiah, there's a whole lot of issues, meaning it's 60-something chapters long, but there's first Isaiah, second Isaiah, and then a third Isaiah. But Ezekiel is the prophet during the Babylonian exile. Whereas, so Daniel is aware of the words of Jeremiah, so he's thinking about some of the stuff he said, which Rabbi Haas alluded to, which is, I'm going to tell you what you're doing wrong and you need to fix it. Okay? But that Jerusalem would be in exile for 70 years. It turns out to only be about 48 to 50 years, give or take, right? He confesses the sin of Israel and pleads for God to restore Israel and the desolated sanctuary of the temple. The angel Gabriel, once again, explains that the 70 years actually stand for 70 weeks of years, or 490 years. It was not 490 years, during which the temple will first be restored and then later defiled by a prince who is to come. Is he talking about Antiochus? Your guess is as good as mine, okay? Then we get to the end of the book, chapters 10, 11, and 12. So in the 3rd year of Cyrus, and by the way, the 3rd year seems to be the line, meaning not at the very beginning, but a little bit into their term, we find out they're not good, therefore this will be the demise of their future. So he sees a vision of an angel, called a man, but clearly a supernatural being, who explains that he's in the midst of a war with the prince of Persia, assisted only by Michael, your prince. The prince of Greece will shortly come, and so forth. The point is that the vision is if the current king is bad, then there'll be another one coming along who might be better, but we're going to find out they're going to be bad too. We learn in chapter 11, a future king of Persia will make war on the king of Greece. A mighty king will arise. This will be eventually the Assyrians, the Seleucids, but become the Greek part of the Greco-Roman Empire from the 2nd century before the Common Era until the Romans really take over, and the latter part going into the Common Era. And we're going to go to war, with different people all the way from Libya and Egypt in the that area to all the way east to what we would call Babylon or the Euphrates Tigris of today. And then finally, this is the piece that I wanted to get to. So at this time, Michael will come. Michael, who is like God. It will be a time of great distress, but all those whose names are written will be delivered. All those names who are written. Multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake, some to everlasting life, others to shame and everlasting contempt. Those who are wise will shine like the brightness of the heavens, and those who lead many to righteousness like the stars forever and ever. The point is, this section is completely out of context of the rest of the Hebrew Bible in the fact that it's never mentioned. What is mentioned or what is duplicated is the narrative style of leadership and dreams and following that directive, if you will. Or the fact is in what we call the Deuteronomic theology. If you follow my laws and regulations, you have blessing. If you don't, then you're going to pay the price with curses. Here it's basically saying, all right, all these kingdoms are going to come and go. As long as you stay faithful, you're going to get your just reward. In the context of this, it makes sense. Is that anyone who was righteous and just all this time, now you're going to finally get your reward. Or as Rabbi Haas said, the Olam Haba, the world to come, time where things are good. And that time, sacrifice will be abolished, and the, quote, abomination that causes desolation. That phrase is when the temple has been desecrated, no longer desecrated. And the idea is that this is when it will happen. We obviously didn't believe that. As a Christian, and I'm going to get out of this in a moment, as a Christian belief system, the system is that you might think, all right, if Daniel is the time of these kingdoms, how long was the time frame between the Greco-Roman and the persecution and execution and resurrection of Jesus? It's not 3.5 years. I want to be very clear about that. Okay, it's strictly an interpretation. So Judaism does not look at the book of Daniel as, oh, we're going to get our candy. We're going to get our just reward. We don't. Rather, we look at it as an interpretation of the horrific challenges of having a Jewish identity and having control of their own Jewish destiny during that time period. All that, of course, will collapse completely with the destruction of the temple in the year 70 by the Romans and the final revolt in the year 135, the Bar Kokhba revolt. And that'll maintain itself until, unfortunately, the modern period of 1948. Questions or comments? Tough group.
You answered them all.
I don't know about that, but I remember studying this in school decades ago, actually 30 years ago. And looking back then going, okay, whatever. I really appreciate it more now, simply for the reason, not the whole apocalyptical stuff or even the eschatology. I am not one of those who believes so much of an afterlife. I believe that what we do now to make a difference now, make the world a little bit better, is a much higher value. But I recognize that we actually have 6 major schools of thought about what happens when we die. The Daniel version is what we call the most traditional. There's much more detail to it that you can find later in our tradition, but at least it lays the foundation. But I also want to be very, very clear. To misappropriate the language and say, see, Daniel said this, we don't interpret it that way. We interpret it in the time frame in which he existed, not after the fact. What was the verse that you covered regarding the Son of Gods? That is chapter 3 of Daniel. I will tell you exactly, one moment.
And it looks like
and
Ann
while I'm
Butchik
doing
had a
that,
question.
I'm sorry, what, Rabbi Bernholtz?
Ann had a question.
Okay, 1 second. Let me take care of that question real fast. Son of God, where are you? 3. I'll go back over here. Rosette did not cast. It is chapter 3, verse 25 of Daniel. Chapter 3, verse 25. And so, Keith, I'm sorry, and Ann, whoever asking the question, go ahead.
Oh, I'm writing so fast, I'm taking notes.
That's all right. Go ahead, ask away.
Wait, what, Michael? Who was Michael? Was he God?
Mickveh, okay, I'm sorry. Yeah, I should make clarify a little better. So, we believe in angels in Judaism, okay? But angels are messengers of God. Angels are not Clarence from It's a Wonderful Life. I want to be very clear, okay? Nothing wrong with Clarence. It's a great story, okay? But what I'm saying is we don't have the vision of, Clarence got his wings. That's not our image, okay? All the angels serve a purpose. And so each of the angels named, the most famous ones that Michael, Gabriel, Raphael, the words actually mean something. Michael means who is like God. Gabriel is God is my strength. Raphael is God heals, or the healing. In other words, they all have a purpose. Whether or not Michael here, or in the Hebrew, Michael, is an actual person or a vision of Daniel to emphasize God's presence, that I can't tell you. Your guess is as good as mine, whatever works best for you. Okay. but it doesn't necessarily mean it has to be an individual, other than Daniel in his vision and his dreams is seeing this idea.
Thank
Well.
you, Rabbi. You didn't have to ruin Clarence for me, though.
Alan Lechner, how does this story translate to our present time where there's a growing threat of anti-Semitism? Many leaders remain silent. So it's interesting. And Rabbi Haas and Rabbi Bernholdt, if you have a different perspective, I would love to hear it. I don't believe that the book of Daniel is addressing anti-Semitism as much as, I mean, they're related in the xenophobic argument, in that the other is rejected. If you don't follow our ways, then you are the other, you're wrong, and therefore we must get rid of you because we see you as a threat. And obviously that's an anti-Semitic behavior, but I see it more as xenophobia in the text. I want to be really clear about that. Sometimes the anti-Jewish part of it is more because they don't understand it, or because the multiple existence of God in their theology. As far as leaders remaining silent, I mean, we know in the Daniel story, every leader that remains silent, what happens? Their kingdoms fall down. Back in the 70s, there were two satires written, and you can find them on the internet. One was The Last Jew, who's on exhibit at the Smithsonian in Washington, D.C., about how no one says anything, aka the Pastor Niemöller poem. You know, they came for somebody else, but then I didn't say anything because I wasn't one of them, but they came for me. There's no one left to say anything. And the other one, which I find even more fascinating, which is more relevant today, is that there's such anti-Semitic fervor in the world that they decide to kick the Jews out and they send them to the moon. And then the Jews establish a whole new world in the moon, and the earth, there's no Jews left on earth. And then they started bickering against each other, and they blame the Jews even though there's no Jews there. And so they send a rocket to the moon, and they end up blowing up the earth by accident, by nuclear, because they didn't know how to do it. And the Jews on the moon try to decide they're going to keep them or not. So in other words, when people are quiet, that's why I love the current campaign about speak up. We're neighbors, we're friends, and so forth. Is it effective? I don't know, but I know it's out there. At least I can tell you my non-Jewish colleagues make a point of saying something in a very positive way. Rabbi Haas, if you want to add anything to that.
Well, I think anti-Semitism is hating Jews just to hate Jews. There's no reason behind it. It's not logical. It's not really anti-Semitism because this is a competition. These guys are jealous and they want their jobs. So it's not really anti-Semitism because if they were a different religion, they would still have the same outcome. It would still be, we want your job, we're trying to find a way to get you out of it. So it's more personal nature. It's very different than what we see maybe in the book of Esther, where Haman is upset at one person and tries to kill all the Jews. They're not trying to do that. So I wouldn't call this anti-Semitism. I think it's more about how we're trying to find a way to bring Jews into the world. It's about putting Daniel in a place where he's in the world. In other words, we want this vision to be part of our world. So we're going to say Daniel, who was a very big mucker guy in Babylon and Persia, this is what he thought. So this was 400 years ago. So obviously it's really important for us to believe this today. If somebody who was the second highest person in both Persia and Babylon believed this, then it must be true. It's kind of like saying, well, Moses did it, so we should do it. So they're trying to create this new vision of Judaism, and they're just on the cusp of saying, we need this heaven view. We need this addition to our religion for it to continue. And so they're saying, well, Daniel first thought of it years ago, as opposed to saying we're thinking of it now. So it's a way to really add some strength to the view.
I would add that one of the things we also heard was that this is he might be located at this time in the nexus of the Babylonian and Persians, but it's possible that this is really coming out at the time of the Maccabees. And what you're seeing is the stresses and strains of the Jewish world at the time of the Maccabees being played out in an earlier time. And that's a really interesting, I mean, we saw that with Ezra and Nehemiah. You see these in these different books. You see that with Esther as well, of that it's not always, how much of this is history and how much of this is midrash? How much of this is the people at a particular time are putting their characters back in history because they need to say something now, but they have to be careful how they say it now, so they'll locate that information in the past, and that becomes a whole dynamic of it. As we're getting closer to 1, I just want to point out I have posted in the chat the link for the playlist for our classes. It is on the Temple Beth Shalom of Vero Beach YouTube channel. So if you go to the Temple Beth Shalom of Vero Beach YouTube channel, you will see a playlist for counting the Omer as an exploration. This will get uploaded probably sometime this afternoon. And so you'll be able to see it, if not a little bit later in the week. And also, I do want to point out that today is the 34th day of the Omer, which is 4 weeks and 6 days in the
That
Omer.
sounds right. That sounds right. Yeah.
So Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu al sfirat Omer. We are counting the Omer. We started on day 6, and here we are into week 4, day 6. And tomorrow will be the 35th day. Yesterday was Lag BaOmer, where we have all sorts of wonderful, rather incredible stories. Some of them even going back to the destruction of the Second Temple, which Rabbi Malinger noted earlier. Any other kinds of Rabbi Malinger and Rabbi Haas, do you have anything else you want to add? So I'm not cutting you off.
I just want to say thank you.
Thank you. All the best to everybody. Hope you have a wonderful summer and enjoy the rest of the study sessions.
And I look forward to seeing you all at Mount Sinai on the 25th.
And so Mount Sinai on the 25th?
25th of May, that night. Yeah.
Thank you. So on the 25th, there will be a Tikkun Leil Shavuot. There will be it's a whole virtual Tikkun Leil Shavuot. And we will be glad to share information on that. Your congregations very well might be already sharing that information. It's a whole beautiful virtual program. I'm also hoping to do a program like this, or not a full series like this, but one night like we did for Purim for Tisha B'Av. So if you know your congregation wants to participate in a virtual Tisha B'Av in July, certainly let me know. And it is just wonderful to have Rabbi Haas and Rabbi Malinger and all of our colleagues. Next week is Rabbi Barbara Goldman Wartell. Give me 1 second to pull up the document. And I know it's Song of Songs. And I know it's Rabbi Barbara Goldman Wartell and Rabbi Estelle Mills. And so we will have a presentation on the Song of Songs. I think, as I said last week, same bat time, same bat channel. So noon Eastern here on this same Zoom link. We hope you will join us. And a big thank you to my colleagues, to Rabbi Haas and Malinger, for bringing this program to us.
Thank you all.
everybody.
Take care.
You have a
Bye-bye.
good